So let's go. So the unique role of Luxembourg in rethinking polar geopolitics, when we came up with this title together with Axel earlier on this year, we were like, that's going to be very provocative because frankly, Luxembourg has no direct role in Antarctic geopolitics. Luxembourg doesn't have any research station in Antarctica. Luxembourg doesn't have any polar ship or research ship going to Antarctica. And Luxembourg is not even a party, a signatory to the Antarctic Treaty. So how can we really connect Luxembourg with Antarctica? Don't forget to turn off your mics, guys. That's important. All right, so how can we connect the two? So the first way to connect the two is basically to question what role can Luxembourg have in future Antarctic governance, because its role is actually real. You know that we're going for human programs on the moon. You know, we are also targeting Mars for those human programs. And basically these activities will require governance. They will require legal systems. They will require tax systems and so forth and so on and so forth. You know that all too well. And you know that Luxembourg has positioned itself as one of those early countries, early adopters throughout the world by simply creating one of the first legal systems to basically allow companies of all sizes to go into the outer space, either to do just simple exploration or to do some commercial mining, commercial tourism, and so on and so forth. So that's how Luxembourg, of course, is definitely connected to space. But then when it comes to Antarctica, things are a little different, as I said, because Luxembourg is not involved. So how can we make this connection? To cover all this, I will basically go through 3 points. I'll start off with just a short introduction to the geopolitics of Antarctica per se. Then we'll go into the main businesses, the main industries currently being developed in Antarctica. So as you see, that's tourism, mining, fishing, and telecommunications. And then later on, we will connect that to what's happening in the outer space. And basically, the thing I'm working on right now the most together with hydrogen, it's basically a question that's somewhat simple to ask, but very difficult to research. And that is definitely, how can the outer space and the Antarctic governance feed each other? First, do they? And second, if they do, how do they do it? And what can be the impacts in the 21st century moving forward? So are you ready to start? If you're ready, I am too. Let's go. So the geopolitics of Antarctica. I don't know if you're all familiar with how things are working out in the South, but the first thing you have to know is that there's a treaty, the Antarctic Treaty or the Washington Treaty, signed in 1959 and entered into force in 1961. And Fabrice has rightfully said that we are going to celebrate a number of anniversaries this year related to the treaty. So basically, these are the 12 original parties. You've got the 7 countries which had claimed territories before the treaty was signed. And these are the ones on the left-hand side of your slide. And then on the right-hand side of your slide it's 5 other countries which have been involved in the so-called International Polar Year in the 1950s, which was basically an international effort to develop research on the polar regions. And the idea back then was to see how what's happening in the polar regions do impact the rest of the world from a meteorological point of view, from an oceanographic point of view, etc., etc. So this is like the basis of the Antarctic governance. And every year there's a meeting, a consultative meeting around the Antarctic Treaty, basically to discuss things that are related to what's happening to Antarctica and to what's in the treaty. And the next one will be in Paris, starting on June the 14th this year. So I'm sure you will hear about it. So right now, the countries that are signatory to the treaty, basically their number has expanded quite a lot. As you saw, we started off in 1959 with 12 countries, and now we have 54. Slovenia being the last one of them. So 54 parties to the treaty, and amongst those 54, 29 countries have a so-called consultative status. You could think about this as some kind of voting rights in some way. When you have a consultative status, you are like a first-class citizen in Antarctica with full voting rights, full responsibilities as well. And when you are a non-consultative status, you're definitely a second-class citizen. You can be on the table, you can be at the table, you can be in the meetings, etc. But for some aspects of the legal governance of the Antarctic, you're going to basically be a second-class citizen, and that's going to be of interest to us later on. You're going to see why when we talk about mining. So basically, you've got these 7 historical territorial claimants. You've got these 5 additional scientific powers from the 1950s, and then a bunch of other countries. China came in the 1980s and has developed quite a lot since. And actually, China is now not creating problems. I shouldn't put it like this, but it's seen as a troublemaker by some Western powers, which are willing, which want Antarctica to remain stable and to avoid conflicts. So here, what you see on this map here, this is a map showing you the major scientific stations on Antarctica. You've got many more than this, but here you've got the major ones, the ones that are the most important, either from a purely numeric point of view, meaning, for example, the McMurdo base that is owned by the US. This is the largest Antarctic base with more than 1,200 person living there during the summertime. But some bases here have a much smaller amount of scientists working on the bases, but might be very important from a strategic point of view, either because there are some very important research capabilities there, some very important communications capabilities, or they are very important from a logistical point of view, or from a symbolic point of view, from a purely political symbolism point of view. So these are the ones you see. This is what you've got here. And there's another element that we need to mention here quickly. You may see them with the little airport sign, the little plane that's black on white. These signs, you don't have many, but you have 4 of them at this moment. These signs represent private landing strips in Antarctica. So you've got 4 of them, which are managed by 2 different companies, one from the US and one from the UK. And basically, this definitely symbolizes the beginning of a possible privatization of Antarctica. Not necessarily at the states level, but possibly at the corporate level. We're going to talk about this later on. So at this point, which countries are really building a meaningful Antarctic presence? So the first one, as you see on this graph right here, with the most populations, that's definitely the US. It's on the US bases. They have 3, so they're not the country with the most bases, but on their 3 bases, they have quite a lot of researchers, logisticians, mechanics, etc., etc. So McMurdo is the largest one by far. Then the second one is the Amundsen Scott, which is also an US base, and it's the South Pole base. So these are the 2 largest ones. Then you've got Mirny, Marambio, Fry, Rotorua. So here you've got some Argentinian, some Russian, some Chilean. The French or the Japanese are not far behind. So basically, you've got countries over there, the ones who are building a meaningful presence. There are either countries who are historical powers, meaning claimants, or countries like the US or Russia who wanted to have a strong presence already in the 1950s when the Cold War broke. And countries like China or South Korea or other kind of powers such as Turkey are just coming in to the continent, and they are quite ambitious as well. So basically, when it comes to Argentina or Chile or the UK, having a strong presence in Antarctica basically supports the territorial claims, that these countries have not relinquished, have not abandoned them. Signing the Antarctic Treaty, if you want to go more into details, you can go to Article 4 of the treaty. It basically says that if you are a claimant state, signing the treaty doesn't mean that you abandon your claim. It just says that the treaty does not recognize the claim, but it also says that any country who signs the treaty cannot do anything to basically refuse you the right to claim the territory that you've claimed before the treaty was signed. So Antarctica, for Argentina, this is big. For Chile, it's big. For Australia, for France, for Norway, for the UK, and for New Zealand, it is still a big deal. And the thing we have in Antarctica is almost a perfect geopolitical setting here. You've got a continent in the middle of an ocean, which is itself in the middle of 3 continental masses. So on Antarctica, you of course have no indigenous population living there. It was first discovered in 1820, so it's once again very young in terms of young to mankind in terms of a territory. And all the countries who have been involved in the 19th or 20th century maintain their involvement today in Antarctica. And then you've got the new ones, the ones which did not send explorers or whatever in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. These guys, these new ones, they have an approach to Antarctica which is less romantic, less related to exploration, less related to these big ideas and big ideals of the early 20th century or the mid 20th century. So they have a more opportunistic approach to Antarctica than what we have in Europe or what they have in North America or even in Japan, because Japan was already involved in the late 19th century in Antarctica, or in Russia, of course. So this is Antarctica today. This continent with scientific basis, no population, shared between 7 countries who claim territories which are not recognized by other people. And here, the first connection we can make between Antarctica and outer space is the way you go to Antarctica and the way you come back from Antarctica. If you want to go to Antarctica, actually, you don't have many options. The only real option that you have is to go through what is called a Antarctic Gateway City, or in French, a Ville Passerelle Antarctique. Basically, you have 7 of them, as you can see, 1 in Chile, 1 in Argentina with Ushuaia, 1 in the UK, meaning here the Falkland Islands with Port Stanley, 1 in South Africa with Cape Town, and then 3 in the Indo-Pacific area with New Zealand, Hobart in Australia, and Perth in Australia as well. So these are the 7 cities that do have a logistical center to basically get you to Antarctica or to get you from Antarctica. And here by logistical center, I mean either a maritime logistical center or an air logistical center for you to reach Antarctica. And so out of those 54 countries, you of course have a handful of global powers with global ambition and reach, which are investing quite a lot in Antarctica. So what you see here is basically a video to promote and explain the big plans that the National Science Foundation, which is the US government's body that supports scientific research in Antarctica, this is their plan to expand the McMurdo scientific bases. The McMurdo base, as you can see, as you've seen already, it's the largest one in Antarctica by far, and it's gonna even be larger by 2026 or 2028, depending on how they cope with COVID. Basically, they want this base to go over 2,000 people working on the base by 2026 or 2028. And basically, when we talk about 2,000 people here, definitely we don't talk about the same thing as the French base on Dumont-d'Urville or the small Chinese base on the A dome, on Dome A, where you will only have a few dozen people. Here, we're talking about a small village in the middle of nowhere with big logistical challenges. And this is basically likely to be a real, actual outpost, American outpost on a continent from which they are very far away. So to some extent, some people call it a colonization attempt. Or rather, let me rephrase this. Some people call the future McMurdo science base a colony, because that's kind of what it's going to be. When you reach the 1,000 people mark or the 2,000 people mark, then it's not just a science base. It goes much deeper, it's much broader than this. And basically, they really want to have tourism going on. They really want to have conferences there for the general public, not just for the scientists living there. Here you see an attempt at what could be the future auditorium. Well, you get my point here. Global powers with global ambition and reach, developing ways to basically project themselves very, very far away from home. But the US are not they're not the only ones doing that. China is also doing the same. And China has, at this point in time, 4 scientific stations in Antarctica, none of which are of the same magnitude as McMurdo or even as the South Pole base, the Edmundson Scott one I talked about. But what's interesting with China's approach is that they've been the first country, together with Russia, to have this comprehensive approach to Antarctica. They have a science base in all the places that actually do matter the most, meaning they have a scientific base on the King George Island, l'île du Roi Georges. So that's going to be off the coast of the Antarctic Peninsula, which is basically the little piece of land that wants to escape from the Antarctic continent and want to reach Latin America. So here, that's going to be on the American facade of the Antarctic continent. Then they have this other base in the Pacific facade of the Antarctic continent. It's going to be built by 2022 or 2023, so it's not out of the ground yet, but it's about to enter in operations. And then you've got this other big one, the Zhongshan science base, which is off the coast of the Brights Bay. So here we are on the Indo-Austral facade of Antarctica, and here we are, more importantly, maybe on the Australian Antarctic territory, meaning the territory on Antarctica that Australia historically claims. So these Zhongshan base, it has on top of its harbor, small harbor, it's more like a jetty, it also has an airstrip. And basically China wants to develop this airstrip and make it like a full year-round, very capable for large planes air hub. That's really what they want to do. They want to build a hub there to maybe reach the other bases, the other parts of the continent, using big planes coming either straight from China or going through a friendly state like Australia or someone else in between. But you get the point here. So Zhongshan is going to be China's main hub in Antarctica. And then they have these 2 other bases which can be reached from Zhongshan, and that's Taishan and Kunlun. So Kunlun is China's latest base. It was constructed in 2009, and it's located on the Dome A, which is basically the highest point on the whole Antarctic continent, the highest point where you can actually put a base. So here we are talking about an altitude of more than 4,200 meters, and basically it's going to be on the ice there. This is an area where no one really has gone to except for China at the moment. And this is very strategic for China because it provides them with a very interesting outpost, basically to observe the outer space. And build connections with outer space capabilities, whether we talk about observatories, whether we talk about intelligence, all these kind of things, telecommunications, positioning. Kunlun might prove useful in the coming years in that sense, connecting Antarctica to the outer space. And Taishan is basically like an intermediary base on the road between Zhongshan and Kunlun. So what is interesting is that those global powers, they don't work alone. They're building regional critical masses, so to speak. And we haven't seen that happening in North America, but in North America, you only have 3 states, so maybe that's the reason why. In Europe, there's this European Polar Board, which is actually the prime body for international cooperation in Antarctica at the European level, with a lot of capabilities, a lot of aircrafts and vessels and etc. Then in Asia, in 2004, China, Japan, and South Korea created their own regional body for international cooperation on polar sciences in the Arctic and Antarctica as well. And now you see that there are several countries that are members of FOPS, and FOPS is becoming a ever more interesting body to study because it's just scientific cooperation, but there's a huge political component to it as well. And even in Latin America, you also have this regional cooperation that's building off. So all these things are happening in Antarctica. Now, if you're still alive and you're still with me, let's go into more details and talk about business this time, which is something that is, of course, very controversial. So I'm not going to spend too much time on fishing because frankly, it doesn't have much to do with what we're going to talk about in the third part regarding space activities. But fishing is definitely opening new spaces in Antarctica. And here, countries like France, Australia, or even the US or China or Russia are directly and heavily involved in the area. For example, to give you an idea, if you talk about the catch of fish in Antarctica or in the Austral Sea, basically the first country in the world in terms of fish catch in Antarctica is France. Actually, France is the leading country in terms of fishing in Antarctica. Then, if you add to fish, if you add krill is not a fish. Krill is basically some kind of highly proteined shrimp. Then France falls to the seventh globally fishing power in Antarctica, and of course, in the top 3, you will find usual suspects such as China. But here, fishing is not really the main area of interest for us. Tourism is. Tourism is because what's happening in Antarctica is likely to happen in space as well. What's happening right now in Antarctic tourism, you see it on this slide right here. It's basically growing and growing. And if COVID had not happened, basically we would have reached last year, that is during the Antarctic summertime, so that is between November and March. So in the Antarctic summer of 2019-2020, we would have gone over the symbolic mark of 75,000 tourists going to Antarctica. And the 100,000 tourist mark isn't far from us, definitely. But COVID happened, so of course we might see a downfall in terms of tourism interest for Antarctica, just like we've seen after the 2008 crisis. But it's going to happen. It's going to happen at least in the 2030s. So we're going to reach the 100,000 tourists mark in Antarctica. That's kind of for sure. And definitely the growth dynamic before COVID was huge. There are not so many industries in which you find growth figures like this. And as you see, we were talking about just one digit in 18 and 19 compared to the 2017-2018 season. But in the last season, when tourism was open in Antarctica, you had not single-digit growth, but double-digit growth compared to the previous year. That is record numbers in Antarctica. And in the tourism sector, it has, of course, generated a lot of interest, a lot of new investors who are seeing this Antarctic tourism as a quite nice sub-industry to invest in. So why does it work so much? Why does it work so well? It works so well because going to Antarctica is socially differentiating. So say you're Chinese, say you are like in the elite in China, you have a lot of money and you don't know where to spend your yearly vacation. How about go to Antarctica? And that may sound maybe trivial, but it's not. Because frankly, when we talk about the Chinese elites, in terms of numbers, we talk about a much bigger number of people than when we talk about the French elites or the German elites or whatever. And the figures for Antarctic tourists, for Chinese Antarctic tourists, they've gone high as early as 2015 up until now. It's almost tripled. It's almost tripled until last season. And definitely there's only one other state that has seen a growth that is not similar, but comparable to what we've seen in China, and that's the US. In the US as well, Antarctic tourism is quite socially differentiating. So it draws definitely a very interesting crowd of artists, of business decision makers, of traders, people in tech, etc., who want to go to Antarctica to experience Antarctica. Some of them want to experience Antarctica before it crumbles and it becomes just one area like the other ones because of climate change. But that's a small part of the tourism going down there. It's basically people who want to not go there for environmental reasons, but just differentiate themselves from their neighbors and friends and whatever. So at this point, if you want to reach Antarctica as a tourist, you're not going to go through Zhongshan. You're not going to go through the French base in Dumont d'Urville or whatever. You're going to go mostly through Latin America. Actually, in the last seasons, 98% of Antarctic tourists have accessed Antarctica from Latin America. So primarily from Chile and Argentina, but also from Uruguay, or even from the Falkland Islands. So here, once again, this is kind of diversifying. And this tourism in Antarctica is mostly seaborne. It's not airborne. It's going to be seaborne. It's a lot of tourism. It's a lot of cruising. And basically, the cruising industry in Antarctica, which we call the expedition cruising industry, it's basically trying to find new routes, trying to find new places to go to, new interesting spots, and so on and so forth. And so basically, if they were to stick to the Antarctic Peninsula, so the closest area of the Antarctic continent to Latin America, then they would be quite limited. Not because the peninsula is small or lacks areas to see. It's not that. The problem is there's just too many tourists already, too many ships. So in a given point in time during the Antarctic season, remember it's only 4 months. If you are on a cruise ship and you want to feel alone, or you want your clients to feel alone rather on the ship, as if they were explorers, discoverers of Antarctica, as if they could feel the adventure, this kind of stuff, then basically what you have to make sure is that they don't see the next vessel, the next cruising vessel that's behind them, or the one that's in front of them. So you need to respect a certain distance between these ships. And right now, the distance between ships is about like 3 kilometers, so that each and every one of those companies, those tour operators and their clients can feel like they're experiencing Antarctica alone by themselves, and they're not part of a massifying industry. And once again, we're talking about massifying in Antarctica. So it's not like we're not going to get like 1 million or 2 million tourists in Antarctica anytime soon, huh? So you need to don't make me say what I didn't say. But so if you want to diversify and if you want to find new routes, new ways, new stuff, there's an easy way to do this. And the easiest way to do this will be to basically go elsewhere in Antarctica. And that's how you end up with companies offering now trans-Antarctic cruises, going to Ushuaia, to New Zealand, or vice versa, maybe stopping at McMurdo, and that's where they're going to have the conferences in the very new auditorium starting in 2026, as I told you. So they're diversifying and they're opening new areas. But also, you've got some new tourism going on that's not just seaborne, but airborne as well. And this is where we're going to find some Chinese tour operators or Chinese very rich tourists, the most, in fact. If you go from China to Cape Town, that's a long trip already. But then if you take a private jet or a larger jet, like an Airbus 319, for example, to go from South Africa to Antarctica, that's a 5.5-hour flight, then basically you will end up in Antarctica, and there you will be really alone because you will be with your 5 or 10 or 12 friends and not with 200 people on the ship. So definitely tour operators are considering the Eastern Antarctic, and there's a whole network of airstrips, telecommunication capabilities, positioning capabilities, and so on and so forth that basically enable this new market to become, I should say. It definitely unlocks new opportunities for these operators. So in that line of thinking, if you stay in China and you ask the government, what are you doing there? They will tell you, we're just doing scientific research. Okay, so then if you ask them, why do you need new bases? Why do you need to expand these activities? Why do you encourage people to go to Antarctica? Then they will tell you, oh, because Antarctica is a common heritage of mankind. So we can experience it. We can go there. We're definitely legitimate to go there as well. Antarctica is not limited to scientists. It's not limited as well to Westerners. We need to go there and experience Antarctica for ourselves and develop a Chinese vision of Antarctica. This approach I've just described is going to be something that you will find as well in South Korea, in even in Pakistan, in Malaysia, in Turkey. And to some extent, the new scientific bases or the new infrastructures that are being built in Antarctica, whether they support these economic activities or not, they contribute to some national prestige. Basically, there's a lot of research in Antarctica that then can inform, help, foster, you name it, industries back home. We can talk here about, of course, telecommunications. We can talk about clothing. We can talk about agriculture. We can talk about energy, hydrogen. Many industries like that find now some research, find some interest in researching some aspects of their technologies or developing new technologies in Antarctica. And for China, it's even a broader issue, because there are some countries which do have ambition in Antarctica, but don't necessarily have the means to go to Antarctica and do whatever they want. So they're seeking international partnerships, and that's where China or other countries, of course, come in and say, yeah, we're going to help you. This is the case here for Brazil, for example. Brazil has partnered with China to build its new base, the Comandante Ferraz the third base in Antarctica. So it was designed by a British company. It was built by the Chinese, and now it's operated by Brazil. So definitely these scientific outposts which are becoming so much more than purely scientific outposts. They can definitely foster international cooperation from a multilateral, trilateral, bilateral perspective. But I mean, for China, what they do, especially in the Dome A area with Kunlun and then the two other bases, Taishan and Zhongshan, that's putting pressure on the historical countries, the historical powers on Antarctica. So it's not putting a lot of pressure on France because China does not operate on the territory that France claims. But for Australia and for New Zealand and for Chile, Argentina, and the UK, where basically China has some capabilities located on these claims, then that's putting a lot of pressure. That's putting a lot of pressure. So what's happening is, if you want to go to Antarctica, you need to have seaborne capabilities. You need to have on-land capabilities as well. That's what you see on the right-hand side. You need to be able to do these inland raids, as we call them. But you also need to have some airborne capabilities, especially if you want to go inland in a faster way than by going with tractors. And same thing, if you want to access Antarctica, then you need to have, as I said, some seaborne capabilities or some airborne capabilities to basically connect your territory with Antarctica. And here, once again, you may see the similarities with space, with the outer space. Once again, if you want to go to the outer space, just like in Antarctica, you need to have sovereign ways to do so. You need to protect them. You need to have a landing pad. You need to have a launch pad, rather. And now it's becoming a landing pad, at least for SpaceX. But you get my point here. So you need to have this launch pad. You need to have all these capabilities. It's just much more than just having this or that capability up in the air or beyond the air for space or here in Antarctica. So ensuring sovereign access is also key. Ensuring local communications, observation, intelligence, etc. That's also key as well. And here, China is lagging behind in Antarctica, but they're catching up quite fast. The countries which have the best capabilities in Antarctica are definitely Norway, Germany, the US. France is not bad either, but China is catching up fast. Now, let's get to the real deal. Tourism is definitely an industry which develops in Antarctica in the same way as it will develop in space. But there's another industry that also does that, and that's mining, and you know it. So here in Antarctica, the legal framework for mining is quite easy to understand. In 1959, there's this Antarctic Treaty that was signed. It has no expiration date. It's been open for amendments since 1991, but no one state has called for talks to rewrite the treaty, to amend the treaty. And what's happened was in the 1980s, some states were actually in favor of creating a special legal framework for mining in Antarctica. Despite all the logistical difficulties, despite the remoteness, despite the overcost and everything, they were thinking, of course, very long term. And they thought, how about we build this mining legal framework? Mining and oil and gas, basically, it was natural resources altogether. But that didn't really work out. Instead, we got the Madrid Protocol. The Madrid Protocol, it was signed in 1991, has no expiration date, can be amended today, but as you're going to see, it's going to be difficult to amend it. So how did we end up with this Madrid Protocol? And how does this relate to space? That's going to be the third part here. So in the 1980s, we've got this big debate. Is it okay to mine for natural resources in Antarctica or not? Whether it's oil, gas, uranium, coal, other stuff, is it okay to do that or not? And basically you had two camps facing each other. The first one was countries led by the US who were saying, yeah, mining is going to happen in Antarctica anyway. If it's not now, it's going to happen in 50 years, 60 years, maybe a century. It's going to happen. So we need to have a legal framework as early as possible while we can kind of control the way it's developed, so that it will be basically into force, and it's going to be the basis for future activities. So that's how, in the 1980s, under the impulsion of the US and also from New Zealand, we ended up with the so-called Wellington Convention, otherwise called CRUMRA, and it's basically the Convention on Natural Resources and Mining in Antarctica. Basically, it was a dedicated text to regulate this. It was signed in 1988 in Wellington, New Zealand, of course, but there were some countries which were not in favor of that. And two countries in particular decided to go fully against it, and that's France and Australia. France and Australia, remember the map that I showed you earlier on? They are friends in Antarctica, right? We are neighbors, in fact. So whatever touches Antarctica, whatever touches Australia and Antarctica is going to likely to have an impact on us as well, and vice versa. So at this point in time, Michel Rocard was prime minister in France, and his counterpart, Bob Hawke, came to him and said, we really should not let CRUMRA come into being. And so after 3 years of lobbying led by France, with Australia, with Belgium and Italy as well, the Wellington Convention was never ratified by the countries that should have ratified it to have it enter into force. So it never entered into force. And instead, France managed, together with their partners, its partners, to convince the US that actually the best legal framework that would protect the US's interest the most in Antarctica should be a ban on mining, not a legal framework to allow it and to control it, because it would not be controllable. Basically, the rationale was to say, if you build a legal framework to control something, you can be sure that at some point in time, it will be devoted, it will be changed, it will be, basically, its raison d'etre will be modified or not respected. So France and Australia pushed for a total ban of mining in Antarctica. And that is the Madrid Protocol on Environmental Protection, whose 30th anniversary we'll celebrate on October the 4th this year. Here, the Article 7 is key, and it's absolutely clear. The Article 7 is just this sentence right here. Any activity relating to mineral resources other than scientific research shall be prohibited. Clear, right? So it's clear. And if you want to amend, if you want to rewrite the treaty, well, the Madrid Protocol, it's going to be complicated. Because if you want to do it now, you will need the unanimity. You will need a unanimous decision. Everyone will have to sign off the amendment. So basically, what it means is that every single one of the 30 plus countries that have signed the Madrid Protocol have some kind of veto power. And then starting in 2048, the rules to rewrite the Madrid Protocol will change just a little bit. The Madrid Protocol will not disappear. As I said, it doesn't have any expiration date, as we may read sometimes in the media. Ooh. What they can do, what those countries who would want mining to happen in Antarctica could do, is basically form a coalition, because if they have the 2/3 majority of the signatories, then they can pass amendments to the Madrid Protocol. So that means having more than 20 countries on board. But this Madrid Protocol is quite perfect from a purely conservationist point of view, because what it says is that in 2048 onwards, okay, you will only need a 2/3 majority of the signatories, but you will also need the consent of all original parties with consultative status back in 1991 when it was signed. And that is 26 countries, including France, including Australia So definitely, France will always have some kind of a veto power against any kind of change related to the Madrid Protocol. But that doesn't mean that this protocol cannot be circumvented. And that's the tricky part. If you are China, if you are Russia, if you are Turkey, if you are, well, whatever country that have signaled in the past few years that they would be maybe possibly interested, I'm being very cautious here once again, in mining in Antarctica. Basically, there are two things you can do. You can just opt out of the Madrid Protocol and of the Antarctic Treaty. There is no police that's going to come and tell you, hey, you're doing a bad job, apart from the public's opinion. Because in fact, all these treaties, Antarctic Treaty, Madrid Protocol, they have no linked to, they're not linked at all to the UN. They are not linked at all to the International Court of Justice. They have no link of that sort. So basically, if a country really wants to pursue mining in Antarctica and is willing to pay the political cost for it, then they just have to opt out. Or if they don't want to opt out, what they can do is start off with mining with research purposes. I told you in the Article 7, any activity other than scientific research is prohibited. So here, if you think about the precedent of whaling, for example, whaling done by Japan, for example, in the Austral seas, in the Austral Ocean, then you know that research fishing, research whaling in such case, has definitely had a commercial aspect to it. But no one really could do anything against Japan. Here, the same thing might apply if the country in question is really trying to push for mining in Antarctica. And this leads us to what's happening into space. And that's going to be what I'm going to talk about for the last 15 minutes. So in the outer space, of course, one of the big issues is mining. Definitely, you know it. So here, when we talk about mining in Antarctica, or we talk about mining in the outer space, then there are some correspondences. In fact, the legal framework for the outer space was derived from the Antarctic Treaty in the first place. When the Outer Space Treaty is signed in 1967, or the Moon Treaty or Moon Accords agreements in 1979 were signed, you definitely have in those treaties a very strong influence of what had been done vis-a-vis the Antarctic. And then what I'm going to tell you is the Artemis Accords. By the way, quick survey, tell me in the chat box or just raise your thumb if you have heard of the Artemis Accords, which were signed last October. That's going to be also very important. So the Artemis Accords, they are definitely influenced not by the Antarctic Treaty, but by the Wellington Convention, the CRAMRA Convention I've talked about. And no wonder why, in the first case, in the CRAMRA case, it was a US-led initiative. In the Artemis Accords, it's also a US-led initiative. So definitely here from a political point of view, just if we, without even scratching the surface, you already see the links that there can be or we can make between Antarctic law and outer space law. So the influence of the Antarctic Treaty on the Outer Space Treaty signed just 8 years later, it's definitely the same, it's definitely there. You've got liberty of access, liberty of operation, no militarization, no weapons of mass destruction, no nuclear capabilities, and so on. And also you've got responsibility. You are responsible for your actions up there. So definitely what we can think, the way we can see the moon, Mars, or asteroids today, we can definitely see them as res nullius areas, meaning the same kind of legal approach or legal framework that you have in the high seas or you have in Antarctica. It doesn't belong to anyone, yet anyone can go, sense of responsibility, no militarization, we'll get the point. So basically, when the EU, well, I should say, when ESA, not EU, when ESA comes in 2016 and says, I want to build a moon village, then definitely they're within the framework, no problem at all. When the US comes in and says, we've got this Artemis program, and we're going to have some boots on the moon ground by 2028 or whatever, we're definitely in the framework. When China comes in with the Chang'e program, same thing, we're in the framework. But now, no problem. But then first catch is the Moon Treaty. The Moon Treaty, we've talked about it just in a second. Basically, it was not ratified by any country with a human program. France and India have signed it, but not ratified it. So it doesn't apply to France and India. The US, China haven't even signed it. So the Moon Treaty, it's there and it's great, but it has no particular enforcement today. And in fact, definitely if we compare the Moon Treaty to the Artemis Accords, then definitely the Artemis Accords are what you could think, how can I put this even more simply? The Artemis Accords, they're some kind of a new moon treaty that's basically dedicated to making possible on the moon and beyond what the Moon Treaty does not allow. And it serves as a way to also create an environment where more and more exploration and possibly the commercialization or the privatization of some resources or maybe some land might be seen as acceptable by some people. And here, I really want you to look at what could happen on the Lunar South Pole. I don't want to say on the Lunar Antarctica, because there's only one Antarctica, but here we can talk about it in the framework of the Aitken Basin. So here what you've got is an area of the moon which is not really explored. That's not where the Apollo missions went, for example. But it's definitely an area that would be quite suitable for a human mission and a permanent presence on the moon. And the reason to that is quite simple. The reason to that is that on this lunar South Pole, there is ice water. And if there's ice water, well, basically you can mine it, and then you can separate, you can electrolyze it. So you can separate the hydrogen on the one hand and the oxygen on the other hand. And you can use your oxygen for your astronauts, of course, and you can use the hydrogen for its energy factor. Definitely possible. You can also build fuel there. You can use this water, this hydrogen, this oxygen to basically build rocket fuel over there. There are plenty of things you can do on the on the lunar South Pole. So if we think about a human presence, permanent presence on the moon, that's where we need to look at. And that's where international agencies, whether it's NASA, whether it's ESA, whether it's the CNSA, etc., that's where we're going to look at it. So the Aitken Basin, as you can see, that's quite big. And the South Pole, you can see it on the left-hand side of the slide. That's basically where you will find the Shackleton crater. The Shackleton crater, well, and once again, it's very funny to see some names for these craters that definitely ring a bell to people in the polar exploration, definitely. So what you can see is that these are not the areas where you had the most exploration, whether it's human exploration or whether it's robotic exploration up until now. But of course, now that we know that there's water there in the form of ice, then definitely we're going to go there more often, and we've got a lot of projects already going in that direction. So that's where Luxembourg comes into play, definitely. Whether it's the 20th of July 2017 law, or whether it's the law voted on December the 15th, 2020, here in Luxembourg, you have a legal framework at the national level, which definitely aims at enabling these capabilities going to space, and especially going to the Lunar South Pole or to asteroids. So this is the reality that Luxembourg has developed right now. And definitely, if you compare that to Luxembourg's influence on international discussions vis-a-vis Antarctica or vis-a-vis the high seas, well, it's nothing comparable. Because here, Luxembourg, even though it's a small country, even though it's a landlocked country, definitely Luxembourg is the second country in the world that has developed such a legal framework, the first one being the US in 2016, without which there would be no Artemis program and no Artemis Accords, by the way. The other way that Luxembourg can influence what's going to happen in space, it's definitely through ESA, because in ESA, once again, Luxembourg is one of the very, very few countries which is willing to advocate for the commercialization of space. And if we consider future space activities, especially in deep space, such as with asteroids, so mining on asteroids, of course, or going to Mars, then definitely what's going to happen to the moon, especially to the South Lunar Pole, to the Lunar South Pole, will matter. Because definitely, if we consider the Lunar South Pole to be the one mandatory stop from a logistical point of view to then reach Mars or to then reach asteroids to mine them, then definitely Luxembourg will have to have a very strong influence program effort on all those discussions at the international level with regards to the legal framework of activities on the Lunar South Pole. So once again, there's going to be people who will want to go to Mars directly, but there's going to be more people willing to go to the moon first and then go to Mars, because definitely this is much easier and less costly to develop as a business model. So definitely we're talking about the moon here, but this is a topic that will definitely expand. And one of the links we can make back to Antarctica is that just like Antarctica, the legal framework that's in place right now, so here we're talking about the Moon Treaty, Articles 6 and 11, definitely shows that the moon shall not be appropriated, but it's not a common property. Natural resources in place shall not become anyone's property, blah, 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 but it might be appropriated legally in certain circumstances. So here in the Moon Treaty, you could already interpret some articles of the treaty in the same way that some people could interpret the Article 7 of the Madrid Protocol for Antarctica. It should not be done, but it might be possible. So that's kind of what we have right now. But the main difference between what's happening up there and what's happening down south is the fact that in Antarctica, as I said, the UN is not involved. And actually, the UN was kicked out of the room in 1956. In 1956, the 12 states that were involved in Antarctic, in the building of this Antarctic legal framework, said, well, this should not be a question. This is not an international question. This is not a universal question. It's a club thing. The club of Antarctic countries, especially the club of the 8 ones the 7 ones that were claiming some territory plus the US. They really wanted to keep the building of this legal framework for Antarctica to themselves. In the outer space, this did not happen because in 1961, a special commission for the peaceful activities, the peaceful uses of the outer space was created, and it's definitely in action today, and it's quite effective. And there will always be a way for those who want to protect the lunar South Pole, the southern part of Mars or whatever, to go back to the UN and to exert some influence there. There's going to be always this way to basically bring in some higher people and some more traditional diplomatic possibilities to basically make sure that no one really messes up with these areas. This is not happening in Antarctica. We don't have that. So why is that interesting? It is interesting because in the future, these legal frameworks for the lunar South Pole, for the moon in general, for Mars, for asteroids, they are likely to inform back the Antarctic debate. And that's kind of the difference between what's happened until now and the future. What's happened until now, remember I told you that the definition of the legal framework of business activities, the definition of whether it was acceptable or not extra in the outer space was influenced by the discussions, the debates with regards to the Antarctic. And now it's likely to be the opposite. But the main difference is that now Antarctica is protected and space is not really. So definitely this could have an influence in the future on the Antarctic Treaty, maybe not, but maybe on the Madrid Protocol. Maybe some other countries will define their own laws, create their own legal framework for mining in Antarctica. Maybe CRAMRA will be revived in one way or another. And definitely countries like France, Australia, well, the historical ones will have to exert a strong influence and basically be very vigilant. So in conclusion, Luxembourg is a small country. It's a beautiful country. I love going to Luxembourg. They've made choices in 2017 just related to space. They were, of course, influenced by all the new space movement, trying to get new jobs, trying to create a new way of international influence for themselves. That's great. But now, Luxembourg should definitely get itself involved in Antarctica as well. Because what's happening up there and the influence that Luxembourg has and will continue to have up there will definitely have big consequences elsewhere. So definitely, this is going to be something to discuss. And that's going to be something in Luxembourg, joining the Antarctic Treaty, developing an Antarctic presence, or at least collaborations that may be of interest. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope it was not frustrating for those who already knew the topic, whether it was the Antarctic issues or whether it was outer space issues. I've talked about this very quickly in my first book, Les Mondes Polaires. It's going to be actually a dedicated part of the re-edition of Les Mondes Polaires next year or the year after, depending on how fast I write it. And I will talk about all these things as well, but with a more hydrogen-centered approach in my book that's coming out soon this year, dedicated to hydrogen.